Dr. Reichelt and colleagues, is it still the authority's policy to have offshore dumping as a last resort?
We adhere to the national guidelines for spoil dumping, which is in fact to allow offshore dumping only as after the first two, the onshore or reclaim, or I think it's termed beneficial reuse, but essentially reclaim to minimise the potential impacts on the marine environment.
Okay. Has GBRMPA ever refused an offshore dumping permit?
We have, as a matter of fact.
Can you tell me about that?
Hay Point, it was refused, I think, around 2006-7. So it must have been 2007, and it was to do with a dredging operation near the Hay Point. I should say that it was refused and then negotiated after. It was eventually approved after a considerable negotiation with the company around the conditions under which it would be approved.
I see. So there was offshore dumping ultimately approved for that project.
But taking you literally, it was initially refused,
okay,
but then allowed, and it was to do with the nature of the material. Some was rock and some was soft sediment, and how that was dispersed and used.
Okay.
So that's one that I am aware of.
Could you please take on notice for me, Dr. Reichelt, if there's been any other refusals of offshore dumping permits? And also, can you just provide me with as much information as possible about the first Hay Point dumping application that was rejected and the reasons it was rejected, and then the final version that was approved, so we can see the differences there? Thanks for that. I've asked you previously whether or not you seek detailed information from the proponent about whether or not they've looked at those alternatives to offshore dumping and the extent of evidence base that you seek from proponents before accepting that offshore dumping is what you will approve. Has there been any change in approach since the last time I asked you about this?
I don't believe so. The Sea Dumping Act applies in the park, and we have delegation on that. The act of dredging that we're referring to generally occurs outside of GBRMPA's jurisdiction, but involves transport into the marine park, and in that space our policies remain the same.
Okay, so you have continued to have the approach of not seeking a detailed evidence base from the proponent about what the alternatives are and whether they've considered those alternatives and
no, our approach has been the
analysis.
opposite of that. I mean, there's only been a couple in my... I'm speaking in my term, which is 6 years. Can only recall a couple, and the approach taken was to suggest at the first pass of the PER document that more effort should be put into describing the alternatives, and we did that 2 years ago. I think I could give you the fine detail on that.
If you could give me
But I believe
as much...
we've spoken about that before.
We have, and I was under a different impression, so if you can give me as much information about the evidence base that you require from proponents before you determine that offshore dumping is indeed the last resort that you will approve, that'd be very helpful. Can I ask now about Abbott Point particularly? I'm across your authority's recent research where you found that offshore dumping in fact travels much further than you'd previously thought due to a number of things, deep ocean currents and so forth. Have you advised the Minister on the likely scope of the Abbott Point offshore dumping and how far that might travel under these new parameters?
The report that you're referring to on the modelling of dispersion with the longshore currents was one I referred to earlier. That's been public now for some time, and it would be, in the context of the Minister, it would be the Department's responsibility to use whatever material was available for their briefing. So in terms of the Abbott Point context, I'd need to defer to the Department. The study you referred to caused a lot of interest in the methodology, and some critics that there were too simplistic assumptions made. Ultimately, our view is that what it showed was that we have more work to do in accurately modelling the dispersion. The criticism of that study was that the plumes that were considered at the extremity were were very dispersed, and the impact, there wasn't evidence that at the extremity there would be any impact from those plumes. But what that tells us is that the potential for impact is there, and it should be studied, should be modelled accurately using best available, three-dimensional, include all current sources and energy regimes rather than, because that's a highly variable environment, so when one does it in relation to the weather. So we've taken that on board, and that's being incorporated into our assessments of the efficacy of, or new assessments of spoil disposal that may come along. I still think we've got a fair way to go with comprehensive modelling of all the sources of sediment movement in the reef region. And the example put to me recently was a cyclone. One major cyclone will mobilise a lot of sediment, but it's essentially unmonitored, untracked and unmeasured. So the multiple sources, multiple impacts, I mean, major storms should be part of a cumulative impact assessment. So.
Okay, look, you've mentioned a few things there that the report indicated there was more work to do to accurately model the dispersion, and that the potential for impact should be studied and modelled. Will GBRMPA do that work for the Abbott Point dumping, or do you hearken to your earlier answer that that's now the department's role to advise the minister about just how bad the offshore dumping will be at Abbott Point?
It's the department's job to brief the minister about
Okay.
Abbott Point.
Okay, well, look, I'll move on then. I'm aware of recent reports that indicate that GBRMPA gave feedback to the department that the cumulative impact assessment of Abbott Point, which was done on a voluntary basis, did not actually take into account the cumulative impacts of the proposal. Can you talk me through why you said that, if that is indeed the view of GBRMPA?
Yes, the cumulative impact assessment of Abbott Point was a very good thing to have done, but what it accumulated was multiple proponents' work into one overall assessment, which I think was innovative for its time. So it's not that it's a bad thing. When our strategic assessment talks about cumulative impact assessment, we're talking about the accumulation of all sources, all impacts over broader timescales. So the two things you're really comparing two different things. So when, in the context of our statement, it wasn't, we were saying it wasn't, when we were saying it wasn't cumulative, someone's overly shortened that phrase. It's the sense it's not done in the style that we interpret now cumulative to mean. However, it was a very positive step for them to take all of the multiple proponents rather than one by one in the same area.
Okay, I'm glad to clarify that, thank you. Now, originally there was a fee for offshore dumping that was mooted a couple of years back. Can you update me on whether that's still on foot and whether the new government has asked to be briefed on that?
No decision was taken by the previous government, and anything that I can say it's not on foot, but I can't speak for what the government may or may not do in future budget settings.
Sure. And the new government hasn't asked for a briefing on that issue?
No.
Okay, great. All right, moving now to your board. I'm not wanting to give the new government any ideas, of course, in that respect.
Well, I'm listening very carefully.
I'm very wary of that look you just gave, Minister Coleman. Moving now to conflicts of interest on the GBRMPA board, which there was some significant media interest in a few weeks ago. It seems to me inappropriate that there be people on your board that have current interests in mining and gas. Are there any moves to tighten the requirements for your board managing its own conflict of interest? The rules seem to me to be too lax if that's what's been allowed to happen.
Thanks, Senator. There's a blend of things in your answer, which is the construction, who is on the board, the province of the Minister and the Governor-General. But there's the issue of conflicts of interest. We have an expertise-based board and they're chosen for their knowledge of industries. How that's managed within the board's the subject now of an inquiry as a result of the media allegations requested by the Minister. We're taking that very seriously and we'll properly investigate and we'll use a a thoroughly independent legal probity expert who's already been announced, Mr. Rob Cornwall, and we're drawing on the good officers of the department to ensure that there's an independence about this review. It's probably, I think it's inappropriate for me to comment on the specifics of that inquiry right now. Natural justice for the individuals concerned, and the fact that I'm awaiting the outcome of that report as well.
So, Dr. Ruckett, my question was more, what will you do to ensure that there are not such conflicts of interest in future?
I'd like to wait for the inquiry
Okay.
and see if that becomes an issue during the inquiry.
Okay. Now, the media reports are that the GBRMPA draft policy statement on port developments was changed after insistence by at least two of the folk on the board, which resulted in protection for biodiversity being weaker in that document. Were they accurate reports? Is that indeed what happened? And have there been any other instances of where policy positions or positions on particular projects have been scrutinised by the board and then the position changed?
No, I don't believe they are correct, and the changes, if any, happen by the experts themselves that write these documents. What the board does is demand highest possible scientific standards and clarity in a legal sense of documents. That particular report that you mentioned, it was in the media, the change that was highlighted was explained at the time, and what it did was the first version was not clear. It was, in fact, sort of legally unenforceable and unusable as a statement, and the subsequent change, which was done by the staff, the board merely highlighted that it was too general a statement and wouldn't be able to be used in decision making. And the board itself isn't a project making decision board, that's delegated to the expert staff. It sets the policy, it advises the minister on future regulation options. It's quite a strategic board.
Okay. Does the board have anything to do with employing those staff?
No.
Okay. Are there going to be a review of any other decisions or policy documents that have been made under the current board to do a check to see if any conflict of interest issues arose in any other instance?
The terms of reference will go to, I think, the any matters that relate to the allegations made in the media.
Okay, so the investigation.
It's up to the independent probity expert to decide how that will be put together.
Okay, sure. Well, look, I'll move on in the short time that I've got. As you would, I'm sure, be aware, the Queensland State Government has now decided to reopen uranium mining in Queensland. Has GBRMPA been asked to advise the Federal Minister or been asked by the Department to advise on the threats to the reef of shipping uranium through it, or any other sort of regulatory or legal framework issues around reopening?
I'm not aware of any requests from any source on that one.
Great. Can you just take on notice and double check that that's the case?
Sure.
That'd be great. What are GBRMPA's views on the risks to the reef from shipping uranium through it?
As I've answered this one previously, we would need to see the nature of the proposal. It's too general a statement to give a precise assessment. With the toxicity of material, whether it's radioactive or not, we would assess that on its merits and the risks to the reef. But we would take it very seriously and make a proper assessment should we have a proposal in front of us.
Thanks very much. And would you be in a position to refuse approval for uranium shipping, or that be within your regulatory scope?
It would. I would need to get legal advice, probably because of the nature of it. It's where they would do it and how it would happen. Would it be inside the marine park, and would it be something requiring a permission? That's why it's difficult for me to be specific.
Well, assuming the ships would transit in the marine park, would the authority be able to prohibit approval for uranium shipping?
I'm not 100% sure. It hasn't come up, and
okay.
We have quite stringent shipping controls, pilotage and designated shipping lanes. Whether it extends to the cargo.
Yeah. Well, could you take that on notice in the very short time I've got left?
Sorry.
Have you advised the new minister on what's required to meet UNESCO's recommendations to keep the reef off the World Heritage in Danger list? Either of your own volition or have you been asked to?
No.
Okay, and the very recent announcement by the Queensland Government that the legacy mine water discharge pilot program in the Fitzroy was going to be extended, was GBRMPA consulted on the effects on the reef of allowing these litres and litres of contaminated legacy mine water to be discharged into the reef?
I've previously been briefed on the issue of Mount Morgan and that area. Because it's some hundreds of kilometres from the ocean as the river flows, as distinct from as the crow flies, there's no detectable impact at the river mouth, so it's sort of not in our jurisdiction. Correct? Yeah.
And are you confident that remains the case with the extension of this program?
I don't see how the extension of it could affect it.
Well, it's presumably going to apply to more mines, not just Mount Morgan.
Oh, I thought you meant in time.
No, sorry, I mean...
No, I haven't had a briefing on other mines and are there ones closer to the reef.
Okay. Well, hopefully that will be put on your radar because it seems like something that you should be consulted on given the possible threats to the reef.
If it's closer to the reef, yes, definitely.
Yeah. And lastly, the bombs that were dropped on the reef. Okay, thanks. Last one. What's the progress of recovering those unexploded ordnances that the American Army dropped on our World Heritage Great Barrier Reef?
The two explosive weapons were recovered a few months after the event. They were detonated at Townsend Island in a designated practice area for the Army and military. Okay. The US military and the Australian Defence Forces cooperated at considerable expense to bring specialists from Alaska and USS Germantown. They retrieved the two weapons safely. The two inert weapons, which are concrete-filled tubes, are resting peacefully on the seabed.
Could you table the cost to the Australian government of that recovery?
I couldn't, I'm sorry. It'd be a question for the Defence
Could the department take that then? Or the Department of Defence?
Possibly Defence Department.
Okay, I'll put it to them.
Okay, time's up. Thank you, Dr Reichard, and for your attendance. I now call on officers from the Department in relation to Program 1.1, Sustainable Management